Those who are just arriving, we're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to get into the Zoom room. So stay tuned and we'll start in about another minute.
How many different time zones are we in? 3?
Yes.
And yours. 4.
Or morning, noon, and night, pretty much.
Yeah. So what time is it in the Netherlands, Julie?
It's 6 in the evening.
And it's for Liz in Portland. What time is it?
9 a.m. We have definitely morning and night.
And noon here in Baltimore. So some of our participants are joining us on the lunch hour, but others at various times, clearly. So, well, it looks like we have about 25 people here in the room. So I'd like to just get started by welcoming everybody. My name is Karen Hupert. I'm the director of the MA in Writing program, and welcome to our monthly author chats. I'm very happy to have Liz Dorr here, an alum, and Julie Phillips, who will be talking about her book, The Baby on the Fire Escape. So I'm going to start by introducing Liz, who is an alumni of our program and is going to moderate our conversation tonight or today. Liz is the co-founder of Scribente Maternum, which is an organization for writer moms. And she writes about social justice issues, parenting, travel, resiliency, and climate change for magazines like Parents, Bloomberg City Lab, Portland Monthly, and Baltimore City Paper. Her first book, which she co-wrote with Lynn Peterson, is called Roadways for People, and it comes out next month in December. So welcome, Liz, and thank you for moderating our conversation today.
Thanks, Karen. I'm really excited to be here and especially excited to introduce Julie. I loved her book, and it feels being a mom and a writer and having to navigate those two spaces. It felt I feel really grateful to be able to have this conversation today. So I'm going to introduce Julie Phillips, who is an American biographer and book critic and the author of The Baby on the Fire Escape, which we're going to be talking about now, Creativity, Mothering, and the Mind-Baby Problem. Her previous book is James Tiptree Jr., The Double Life of Alice B. Sheldon. She's received a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and residencies at Hedgebrook and Willapa Bay AIR, the Artist Residence Program, and has won honors including the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Hugo and Locus Awards. Beginning her career as a writer for Seattle Weekly and the Village Voice, Phillips has written for publications including The New Yorker, Ms., Lieber, a feminist review, The Washington Post, Interview, and the Cascadian Subduction Zone. She currently reviews books for the arts website 4 Columns and writes about English language fiction for the Dutch daily newspaper Trouw. She is working on a biography of Ursula K. Le Guin. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie. Julie, if you wanted to kind of kick it off and say anything else about yourself and the book, and then jump in with reading from the book, and then we'll have time for questions after. I'll kind of kick it off with a couple of questions for Julie, but if you all have questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. Karen's monitoring, and we'll send them to me in the chat. And so after I kick it off with a couple of questions, we'll have that opportunity. So feel free to go ahead and ask questions at any time, and then we'll get to them as when the time after Julie's reading. So Julie, take it away. I'll let you start reading from the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is what the book looks like. It's got a picture by Alice Neal on the cover, which I'm very lucky to be able to use. She's one of the women that I wrote about. And I thought when I started doing this, that I was just writing literary biography. And the reception of it has been interesting because I think people look at it as almost a how to write book more than, literary biography is always about the conditions under which the work is produced and the psychological and the physical conditions. And yet this seemed to be, mothering seems to be just another category of condition, a different set of circumstances from other circumstances in really interesting ways. And I'm going to start just by reading part of the introduction, which is about what you think writing is and about what writing can be. Picture an artist or writer at work, and you probably imagine sustained solitary concentration. Proust scribbling in bed in his cork-lined room. Yeats descending from his tower, encountering his 2 children and asking, "Who are they?" Wittgenstein is said to have eaten nothing but Swiss cheese sandwiches for weeks on end because even changes in the flavor of his food disturbed his thoughts. The artist may be in the midst of family life, but obsessively at work, like Henri Matisse, whose painting pulled him in like a vortex. He could think of nothing else, his daughter said. She may be an art monster, Jenny Ophil's term for the creator who lives only for the work. The great writer may be a detached observer, a flaneur soaking up scenes of city life. If natural beauty is his subject, he may write alone in a cabin in the woods or wander lonely as a cloud, enjoying the bliss of solitude. She may agree with the poet Mary Oliver that creative work needs solitude, it needs concentration, it needs the whole sky to fly in and no eye watching. Or with Gertrude Stein, who warned, "It takes a lot of time to be a genius. You have to sit around so much doing nothing, really doing nothing." A typical picture of a woman with children is of someone whose children are constantly breaking in. Perhaps she has shut herself into a room to write. The children have promised not to knock or to make noise, but she knows they're there because they're lying down and breathing under the door. Adrienne Rich longed in vain amid the discontinuity of female life with its attention to small chores for the freedom to press on, to enter the currents of thought like a glider pilot, knowing that your motion can be sustained, that the buoyancy of your attention will not be suddenly snatched away. Alice Walker saw her daughter in her mind's eye as she worked, the lonely sucking of her thumb, a giant stopper in my throat. But in place of the solitary flaneur, imagine Naomi Mitchison in a London park, writing on a board balanced on her pram. Think of Shirley Jackson making plot notes in the kitchen while dinner was on the stove. Toni Morrison driving to work with a pad of paper in the car so that she could write whenever the traffic slowed. Here, the act of writing is not continuous, but provisional, contingent, subject to disruption. And yet, the words are still coming, and the work is getting done. The expectation that women, more than men, even now, should be ever present for their children can feel incompatible with creative selfhood. It can be hard for parents to give themselves permission. The painter Alice Neel said that until she received a major retrospective in her 70s, I had always felt, in a sense, that I didn't have a right to paint because I had 2 sons and I had so many things I should be doing, and here I was painting. Sometimes the judgment came from others. Neel's in-laws claimed, on no evidence, that she had once left her baby on the fire escape of her New York apartment when she was trying to finish a painting. It's a vivid image of the dangers in their mind of trying to do 2 things at once. Maternal bliss conspires with maternal guilt to erode creative work. Margaret Mead said, "It's not because the baby cries, but because the baby smiles so much that the hours get lost." Jenny Ophil said, "The love you feel for your child has a way of obliterating whatever you used to think you loved." In 1962, Tilly Olson could still state that almost no mothers or any other part-time, part-self persons had written books that would endure. But in or about that same year, the careers of women with children were beginning to flourish, not just in ones and twos, but in numbers big enough to matter. I've tried in this book to trace the course of that change. I've tried to find out what mothering plus creativity looks like, not just in the first few years, but as part of a life story. What does it mean to create, not alone in a room of one's own, but in a shared space? What kinds of work have come out of that space? What is the shape of a creative mother's life? This was my plan, to explore the blank spot on the map where mothering and creativity converged. I had never been able to convey the full power of my own life as a mother. I remember how empty even the simple sentence, "I have 2 children," felt in comparison to the experience, as though I was recounting a dream that made no sense to anyone else or in daylight. Because I didn't have words, I wanted others to speak for me. In investigating the lives of great women, I hoped to see my own experience with new eyes. That blank spot should have told me something. The more I read and wrote, the more the place where mothering and creative work come together seemed not to be an intersection of identities, but a negative space, an impossible position. I read brilliant first-person accounts of mothering, but couldn't see patterns or a path. The stories of my subjects' lives as mothers wouldn't hang together. When I looked at the work, the mothering vanished, and vice versa. When I read essays, memoirs, and stories, I found contradictions, fragments, anecdotes, scraps of enlightenment. I encountered what psychoanalytic theorist Lisa Breitzer calls the intractable problem of how intellectual and maternal labor appear to cancel one another out. Where is mother's creative self? Do mothers have inner lives? What is the subjective experience of being a mother? And why, despite a steadily growing body of writing on the phenomenology of mothering, does it still seem, on a deeper level, so unnarratable, undramatic, everywhere in practice, but in theory, nowhere? I started saying I was exploring maternal subjectivity. That got some people's attention, especially academics, or at least it didn't make their eyes glaze over the way I'm writing about mothers did. Proposing mother as a subject position surprises people, and it also baffles them. Over and over again, my friends forgot the subject of my book until I started to wonder if my blank space on the map was unthinkable, beyond memory. The mother started to seem like, in Breitze's words, the impossible subject par excellence, a shadowy figure who seems to disappear from the many discourses that explicitly try to account for her. My sexuality and gender can be theorized as social and historical constructs. My vocation as a writer may originate in my childhood experience. But what about my relationship to my child and to myself as a mother? Am I supposed to put a fence around that and call it a theory-free zone? Is it true that the mother is, as the French feminists have suggested, unspeakable in a phallocentric tongue? Maggie Nelson writes that she rejects the quarantining of the feminine or the maternal from the realm of intellectual profundity. But she also quotes the poet Alice Norton. "He is born and I am undone, feel as if I will never be, was never born." Playwright Sarah Ruhl, looking at the lack of mothers as protagonists, wonders if the experience of motherhood is unstageable, beyond narrative and language. Then she worries that the experience is tellable, but no one wants to see it. Mothers aren't meant to have points of view. In her memoir, A Life's Work, Rachel Cusk comments that the experience of motherhood loses nearly everything in its transition to the outside world. In motherhood, a woman exchanges her public significance for a range of private meanings, and like sounds outside a certain range, they can be very difficult for other people to identify. In queer theory, mothers are too heteronormative, while African American writing emphasizes the primacy of mothers, but often in a context of working toward the future rather than agency in the now. You might think that the parenting of infants is simply too low in status, too abject, too deep in what Sylvia Plath called the stink of fat and baby crap for theoretical interest. But that can't be the real problem, since even bodily waste has been a site of critical thought. Though when I page through the French theorist Dominique Laporte's tongue-in-cheek Histoire de la Merde, I find that even he has left out the most poop-stained of all human relationships, the parent-infant bond. Many writers almost reflexively protect the mother-child space, conspiring to keep it unexamined. This might be a question of the child's privacy, or of one's own inadmissible feelings. It might be lack of distance. Sarah Manguso asks, is it possible to truly observe one's own child, as a writer must, while also simultaneously loving him? Does a mother have something like writer's block, perceiver's block? Feminist psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva sees mother love as, quote, an escape from representation and its unrepresentability as its subversive power. In her famous essay Stabat Mater, she calls mothering a catastrophe of identity that casts the self into that unnameable that somehow involves our imaginary representations of femininity, non-language, or the body. This relegation to the unnameable feels not far removed from Ursula Le Guin's cynical observation that to become a wife and mother is to turn into a nobody. I find it unsatisfying, another mythification. I can't believe that mothering is beyond representation. I think making mothers mysterious is another way of keeping them unacknowledged. It also sounds like one of my kids complaining that they can't find their favorite shirt. Where have you looked? Have you tried looking harder?
Thank you so much, Julie. Excuse me. As a writer mom myself, I feel like there's so much that it brings up for me. And I'm like in the thick of it with a 5-year-old. And so I just think it's so inspiring to also actually see these writers that we've grown to love as writers, as kind of their full selves as mothers. And so, so with that, I kind of want to kick it off with a question about, like, really, how did you get started writing this book? What was the inspiration for it? And then what was your process in kind of getting moving on it?
Yeah, it originally started because I was curious about mothers who had left their children in order to write and to make art. But I decided that would be too depressing as the subject of a book. And as it turns out, often it isn't even true that that's sort of a slander that is that it's something that's said of women who turn out to have lost their children through circumstances beyond their control. But there's a quote in the book from the daughter of Frida Lawrence, who sort of famously left her children in order to be with D.H. Lawrence. And the daughter said that I think she thought that her mother had done the right thing. And all of the boring women who told me, oh, I could never leave my children, have helped to convince me that she was right. And I thought about sort of the incredible boringness of mother love and the incredible compellingness at the same time. And I just, I really needed that space that comment about how dull it was gave me, that space to kind of step back and say, okay, you can remove yourself from that mother love and it will still go on and be there, but you don't have to be in that headspace all the time. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of permission giving that comment. And so I ended up thinking about the space that I called the baby on the fire escape, which is a space in between, going away from your child and being with your child to write. And then I started writing these essays and they wouldn't come together and they wouldn't come together. And I couldn't figure out why. I thought there was something wrong with me that I couldn't make these essays be a harmonious whole. And eventually I realized that they were inevitably going to be interrupted, that the whole nature of what I was writing about is interruptive, and that I had to then think about sort of the moments when creative lives were interrupted by mothering, or maternal lives were interrupted by creativity, and where they came back together. And how mothering, interrupts selfhood and makes your sense of self fall apart, and how women recollected themselves. And that became the narrative that carried me through, was this narrative of recollection, of pulling yourself back together, and over and over, really, the course of a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, and that actually, you and I had talked about this. The structure of the book was really unique. I think, I don't know if many people have read the book, but it might be useful to talk a little bit about the structure of the book and how you came to kind of come to this unique way of approaching the narrative throughout.
Yeah, I sort of wanted it to be one of these books where my own personal narrative was running through it, and then I could just drop in on other people's narratives. But I had a couple of problems with that. One of them was just that I'm a biographer, and I got so interested in their biographies that I kept losing sight of myself. And, I got so caught up in the narratives of their lives that though I would, start the chapter determined to kind of take over and, dominate the narrative, and that I found them dominating the narrative. And part of it was this desire to step back from the individual circumstances that can be so fascinating, but are also kind of banal. I didn't really solve the problem of the dream experience, the sense that it was difficult to translate what on paper seems like a hope of sort of anecdotes and dirty tempers into narrative. And I'm not saying it's not possible. Somehow the route that I chose didn't seem to allow for that. And I ended up making it into a kind of kitchen sink book. I felt I'd came across so many interesting quotes from so many writers that I made entire chapters out of quotes. And I thought, Tilly Olson has that book Silences, which is a wonderful resource for anyone writing about women's writing, because it is so full of quotes and it is so full of women's experiences. And I decided to just fill it up with stuff. And at some point when it was almost done and I could think, this isn't the right shape for the book, I don't know what shape it should be, I thought, if it's going to be a monster, I'm just going to make it my monster. I'm going to write the book that in the shape that it seems to me to need to be. And if it's a monstrous book, I'm just going to, I'm going to add another couple of legs and arms and eyes. Let it be what it is.
Yeah. I thought it was beautiful. And I loved the way that you did shape it. And it kind of, I also am curious. So for those who haven't read the book, there are kind of some primary characters in it throughout, and then they're kind of secondary characters of writer mothers. And so I'm curious, what made you choose the writers that not just writers, but artists, because Alice Neal is also featured, but what made you decide on those particular women to shape the major components of the narrative?
Yeah, my original thought was that I didn't want to make it too difficult for myself. So I tried to choose women who had written or made art about their motherhood, so that I had access to their inner world and to their experience. And also women who had mostly women who had biographies, or in the case of Ursula Le Guin, whose life I was already working on. So that was my original criterion. And I didn't want to go too far back into the 19th century because I felt like everybody's read about Rebecca West and everybody knows the old stories. And I wanted to be in a century where I felt like we didn't know yet what these writers' and artists' lives were like.
Mhm.
And then I didn't want to write about women who were too young, because I wanted the whole arc of a life in which mothering was a part. I wanted old age as a mother. I wanted being a grandmother. I wanted, the time when the children left home, which turned out to be a crisis for a lot of mothers, oddly enough. So I chose women born between 1900 and 1945. And I ended up choosing only 6 because it's really hard work to do that much research, to do that really intense, intimate research. I tried to choose diversity of income, diversity of background, racial diversity, straight and lesbian mothers. Writing about Black women's experience was really difficult for me. I went into it going, yes, of course the book is going to be diverse, and then was confronted with how much I didn't know about Black women's experience, and had to do a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, before I felt like I could approach that experience, and even probably haven't done as good a job as I wish I could have done. It was really, I felt like that extra work was worth it. It was so important. It made me realize how little support there is for biographies of women of color, and get frustrated by that, because I was dependent on these secondary sources that often either weren't there or had not, had been written by academics taking time off between their day jobs to do this, and hadn't had the time and resources to write the best book they could.
Yeah, no, I found that, I mean, especially, so just for those who haven't read it, do you want to just go over who the 6 main mothers are, just to get, for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah, the main characters are Alice Neal, whose first child died and whose second child was essentially, taken by the father's family to raise, and she felt like she could maybe have gotten her child back, but she would have had to give up painting, and she had a nervous breakdown and tried to commit suicide more than once, and was in a mental institution for a year trying to recover from that decision, and to kind of come to terms with the acknowledgement that she needed to paint. And then she later had 2 children in other relationships. Doris Lessing, who married very early, decided to leave that marriage, was not given custody of her children, and then had to kind of live with the stigma of, oh, you abandoned your first 2 children. When, I realized from looking at her letters, no, she did not. She didn't. She tried to get, it was the marriage that she couldn't stay in. It wasn't motherhood. So again, people who I thought were, oh, she abandoned her children, which turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to that story.
And Ursula Gwynn, who had, I think, the most kind of, from a modern point of view, normal middle class marriage, where her husband managed to, was a huge help to her in doing her work, was really supportive. And Audre Lorde, I was originally going to do Susan Sontag as a major character. I didn't like her enough, and I didn't feel like I had enough access to her in her life. She has all these diaries, and I felt like she was writing, I almost felt like she was taking dictation from her therapist in her diaries, but not that it wasn't a real inner life that I was getting access to. And so I switched places and ended up liking it. And she had one of my favorite things in the book is her relationship with poet Diane de Prima. They were high school best friends, and then they were poets together in the New York beat scene, and then they had kids, and Audrey would send Diane baby clothes, and Diane published Audrey's first book, and Diane gave Audrey a desk, and Audrey was the midwife for Diane's fourth child. And so they had this relationship in which mothering and writing were entirely mixed up with each other, that I thought was a really great model for a creative friendship.
Really?
And then Alice Walker and Angela Carter, who had her child very late, and with a spouse who was a full-time dad. And I thought that was most interesting, because she was the one who decided most deliberately to have a child, and went through the most work in order to get to a place where she felt like she could be becoming a mother until she was 43.
Yeah, I love that. I also just want to remind folks to, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A, and we will put those questions up to Julie as well. So feel free to go ahead and put those there. One of the other themes that I thought was really important, and especially you introduce it as well, as around reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and how essential those are to the mothering narrative. And so if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, and how, I mean, and it was a theme throughout pretty much every single character's life, some form of it, either lack of access to abortion care, or the choice to have children, all of that. And so if you can talk a little bit about that theme, I think that especially is really resonant right now in the post-Dobbs, the post-Roe world. And so I'd be curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the women in my book had also different numbers of children, I think ranging from 1 to 7. But the need for some kind of control over your fertility is, a constant in all of their lives. The attempt to find illegal abortions, the desire to live a full sexual life was incredibly important. The opportunity to do that was incredibly important for all these women. It's not like you can just say, oh, if you want to be a writer, just live a celibate life. We can all be Jane Austen. It's not like that realistically, and shouldn't be like that. And so, I realized that mother writing is made possible by contraception and reproductive care and reproductive justice, which is the larger umbrella concept of having enough support, having enough time, having enough health care. And that affected everyone's lives. The struggle to raise kids as a painter who isn't earning money, the struggle to find childcare, sometimes the struggle for health care or for not getting your health care needs met, having a really terrible childbirth, and having a trauma from that really carries over into I think the right to time is under discussed and underrated. There's this idea that, yes, of course, women should have health care so that they can be productive members of society and they can go do their job, and they can and the thought that everybody has a right to time to do whatever to a certain amount of time to do whatever they want doesn't seem to be. I feel like there's more of that in the Netherlands where I live, because there is subsidized daycare, and I feel like the implication of that is you don't have to earn money to pay the childcare back. You can have the childcare, can afford it, whether your job pays for it or not, because you have a right to it. And that to me was really validating, valuable. So, a writer not making much money is huge for me.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a comment/question from Jacqueline. Says, I really relish the language and the detail of this book and the ways it so poignantly describes the experience through these fascinating narrative biographies. I would love to hear some encouragement or advice for mother writers who have stopped creating when the words are not flowing under the constraints of parenthood.
I would say that there's still time. I also wrote about women like Penelope Fitzgerald, who she was never completely not writing when she was a mother, but she was not writing, writing in very small amounts. And then as the minute her kids were out of the house, her career took off. She went through a lot of changes in her life, that she had a burden, I think, of class and intellectual expectation on her that fell away at a certain point, feeling much more free to do her own work. Louise Bourgeois stopped. She was still working as an artist, but she wasn't showing her work. She wasn't, for 10 years, she completely retired from public life, and then she slowly got it together, and her career took off when she was in her 70s. Ursula Le Guin's mother became a best-selling writer when she was in her 60s. There's time, there's time, as long, I would say, as you don't give up too much of yourself. If you hang on to a sense of selfhood, a sense of independent selfhood, whatever form that takes for you, then you're building up material, then up knowledge, then you're the kind of you're tending the well springs that can fill up. I felt like sometimes for some women, once that space was free, that the creativity welled up by itself, and the work was left behind by kids leaving home.
Yeah, that sense of selfhood too is really resonant for me too. I think that the interesting thing is that, at least for me, when writing was actually the way to kind of recapture some of that selfhood after my son was born, because it's such a life shift, and I also made a career shift, and writing was kind of in the background, and then I pushed it to the forefront because I needed to have that sense of self. And so I feel like that is something that I read, that I sensed so much from all of the writer, or the I always say writers because most of them are writers,
most of them
artist mothers, creative mothers, and that creativity, and even those little pieces of creativity are helpful every once in a while to kind of recapture that.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved Barbara Hepworth saying, even if I just do half an hour a day of my sculpture, or one of her tactics as an artist was to put on records. So when she then, if she had to go be with the kids, she could, take the needle off the record, and then she could start up again at the same place, and she could get back. She used that to get into the same creative headspace.
Yeah.
Because, switching back and forth is always really hard for me.
Oof,
instantly distractible. So, the more concentration you have, the better, but it's nothing's impossible.
But I have to say, mothers are amazing at switching back and forth. It's like, this different part of your brain kind of comes alive when you have kids, when you have to toggle between the multiple spaces.
Yeah, I think, apparently your brain actually does get rewired by motherhood. that.
Yeah, didn't you were telling me that you wrote a review of a book about
It's not out yet, a book called Mother Brain by Chelsea Conaboy that looks at new studies of, MRI studies of what happens to the brains of people who care for children. And it's like a complete reorganization.
Yeah, I can't wait. I want to read that. So we have a question from Patricia Steckler. Can you characterize benefits, if any, to mother artists that arise from going in and out of these two selves? In other words, do these conflicting roles enrich their writing or art?
I think that they can. I think that they can in different ways. I mean, Ursula Le Guin gave some of her maternal experience to the male characters that she was writing about. She needed a little bit of extra distance in order to write about that. And only later was able to write about women characters who were doing the same. But she drew on that. Alice Neal painted wonderful portraits of pregnant women, of women with small children, of families, in which you see that she just understands the dynamics so vividly. So, she has such a deep understanding of the dynamics of parenthood. I think, I don't know if Susan Sontag ever did any writing. It also, for some parents experience it as a hindrance, but, or Le Guin experienced it, motherhood as being this kind of reassuring space that allowed her to write. So it can help the process as well as the perception. I do think there's a fantasy on the part of both people who are children and people who are readers and viewers of art, that the artist or the writer is entirely there for them, like their mother is there for them. I think there's a distrust of work that's interrupted because it feels like, oh, that's not what I came here for. I want your attention. I want you to be entirely devoted to this world that you've created for me. I want you to be accessible to me. And I think that's partly behind the art monster, this notion that this desire for control that children have over their mothers and that the reader has over the work.
That's so interesting. It's like as a writer, you're also kind of acting as mother to the reader too.
In a sense, yeah. And so people don't like to think about the circumstances. The cork-lined room is much more appealing because here's somebody completely devoted to your pleasure, as opposed to, somebody who's looking away from this book to do something else. But I think that, part of the myth of the art monster is that design, the kind of, mother or Byronic lover or something, somebody who is all yours in that moment. But, and yet the outside experience coming in, experience of interruption, and the brilliance in structure of the work of some writer mothers like Sarah Mancuso.
Yeah. So Karen has a question. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the book a bit more? So every couple of chapters, the biography part is interrupted. Speaking of interruption, is interrupted with something you call the discomfort zone. Can you talk about how you decided to structure the book this way?
It was, in some ways, it was an excuse to put in all of the, not only all the quotes, but all of the writers that I'd had to leave out of elsewhere. Yeah. It was an excuse to talk about Louise Bourgeois and about Diane de Prima and about Gwendolyn Brooks and other kind of wonderful writer mothers, but it was also a way to talk about certain themes that seemed to come up, the way everybody seemed to go silent in the 1950s, a lot of women writers, the way those were kind of, that was a period of struggle, the way a lot of women, especially the younger women, used polyamorous relationships and multiple partners to moderate men's expectations, to give themselves permission. I think Alice Neal said of one lover that, you know, he was always chasing after the girls, but that was fine because it gave me time to paint. It meant that she didn't have, it kept them from falling into that traditional role that required the woman's devotion to her partner, because they were always having to keep their partners as well as their children at arm's length. But I thought that was weird, and it made me kind of uncomfortable. So I was like, let's look at that. Let's look at why that makes me uncomfortable. Is that okay? Is it not okay? I was made uncomfortable by the ways that Susan Sontag, I thought, chose her writing over an authentic relationship with her child, which was, I didn't ever want to say bad mother about any, but I felt like I could say that, as a mother, you then lose an opportunity to enjoy the pleasures of that authentic relationship. I kept trying to look from the mother's experience, not to be judgmental. And I just remember thinking at one point, I can't keep doing this. I feel like I'm repressing some really judgmental, cranky part of myself that says, no, you can't do it this way. And so that was also a way for me to let that other side of myself be present in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up another question about kind of as a biographer and having to withhold judgment and kind of permitting that ambivalence. So, I mean, I guess from just general perspective, like how necessary is that for writing biography? And then maybe even speak a little bit more about having to do that, especially when there were some really challenging I mean, I think as a reader, like we can judge as a reader by being offered the information that we're given, but that's really difficult to do as the biographer, as the one offering that information. And so, in particular, Susan Sontag, that was a really hard one for me to read too, because I've really loved her writing. And so now knowing more about her was actually like more difficult to like her, but it wasn't because of the way you presented the information. It was just the information that was presented. And so I'm curious about like that process and really having to kind of pull that back a little bit.
Actually, one thing that I didn't say in the book, that because it's such pure speculation, is that I started to wonder if Sontag maybe wasn't on the autism spectrum.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I talked about that with somebody who knew her really well after the book came out, who sort of wondered if her husband and her son maybe didn't also have that quality. And then it would have been really interesting if I had to have known that, actually, and to think
that makes it seems to like, I mean, that knowing that actually enlightens a lot more of that, the relationships that they had.
Yeah. And if something is your, if that's your limitation, then that removes a whole layer of judgment, because that is, a lot of things that we assume are character flaws are not actually character flaws in this world, I have to say.
I think that's an important point. And I think that it goes to the assumption that when a mother leaves their child, that it's a black and white situation, kind of the way you entered the biography, and the act of like finding more information actually, and revealing the person and who they are gives that more two-dimensional picture of that.
But as a biographer, I also find difficult people, complicated people, really lovable. I love it when they are, going in different directions at once, and when they are kind of impossible for the people around them for reasons that I sort of sympathize with. And when, and of course, writers who become famous have to put up boundaries to their public self, just so as not to become and have a relationship. Then I think the relationship between the public self and the private self becomes extra intense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We have two more questions from the audience, and then I think we might wrap up. So from Joanne Kavanaugh Simpson, do you see an increased focus on empathy from mother writers or artists, possibly like female world leaders seem more open to and adept at dealing with climate change, perhaps an eye to the future, a generational or longer term view on progress? So I think I'm interpreting this as like more empathy towards mothers in the public sphere, public facing mothers. Is that right, Joanne? If you wanted to
or is that that women from their motherhood are able to bring more empathy to the
maybe Joanne, if you wanted to highlight that, but I think that maybe is good. We can interpret it in their writing. So if the empathy in their writing is kind of increased and more adept because of their motherhood and the topics.
Yeah, I think that may be true, although I'm not always sure that it benefits the writing. That sounds really stupid, but Angela Carter, who tackled really dark subjects at the beginning, she and whose books really, if you're looking from a biographical point of view, they really reflect her mood at any given moment, at any given period of her life. When she was in love, she was writing happy books. When she was out of love, she was writing angry books. And she said apparently that it became really hard for her to write about dark subjects when she had first had a baby, because that was it was too much for her. It was it felt like a jinx. And the person who told me that was Faye Weldon, who said that was also the case for her. And she is pretty dark in her writing, but she had to back off from that apparently, or was tempted to back off from that. And I checked it with Margaret Atwood, who said, oh yeah, I think all mothers feel like that right after they've had a kid. And so there's in some ways a reluctance to tackle violent subject matter. But I think that it must be possible. Certainly you see it in Alice Neel, bringing that extra in. I think you have to bring, and you definitely see it with Doris Lessing, who wrote all those wonderful autobiographical novels about her early motherhood. And, the Golden Notebook is full of kind of great observations about motherhood. But you do, I think, have to temper it with critical gaze of the person who's aware that it's born. You can't be too, I don't know. I love Mary Cassatt, who wasn't a mother, but has this kind of wonderful empathy, maternal bliss too, and who's always kind of painting maternal bliss over and over. But I think also with a critical eye, like, what is this that these women are experiencing? Did I miss out? What does it mean? What's happened to these people?
Yeah. Yeah. And Julie, or is it Julie or Joanne? Joanne, sorry.
Oh yeah, social justice.
Yeah, about
is a
like
great.
and future thinking about like,
Yeah,
I
Sarah
think
Reddick is a really interesting writer on motherhood and social justice.
who was
Sarah Reddick,
Mm.
who sees motherhood as the origin of a philosophy for fixing the world.
Yeah, and
you know, there were also, you know, white mothers of school children led the resistance to desegregation in the South because they wanted their children to go to all white schools because they thought that that was better for children. So I would love to think that motherhood, the impulses in motherhood are going to fix the world. But
yeah.
I'm kind of cynical about that, to be really honest.
I know, and I haven't read it yet, but I really am eager to read Angela Garbus's Essential Labor: Mothering as Social Change. I feel like that, I think that there is like a huge power in motherhood and like really channeling that. It might not be, I think that's the thing, it's not, it kind of depends on the person. I think with anything,
you know, I think if you created a world that was, you know, livable for mothers, that you would create a world that was livable for a lot of other people.
Yes, exactly.
You
and
know,
mothers who are thinking
health care, you would have income, you know, and guaranteed income for all. Socialism is really much better for mothers.
Yes, that
capitalism, I have to say.
Well, and mothers
but
also thinking about their children and the world that their children are going to be living in too. There is that. I think that that's what Joanne also is thinking about.
But that can be very selfishly focused and narrowly focused on your own children and not a world that's better for everybody's children.
Yep. I think that we're seeing that now with a lot of the resistance against critical race theory. There's that like internal, we have one more question and then we're going to wrap up, but from Judith Harding, you've obviously done a ton of research. How much time did you spend on the research and then on the writing?
I'm ashamed to say that it took me like 10 years in fits and starts to write this book. I mean, I was working on other things. I was working on the Le Guin biography. I was working on journalism. But the hardest part for me was just figuring out the structure, figuring out why the essays weren't working. I did a lot of kind of Goldilocks research. This book isn't what, you know, this book is to this book is to that. I read a lot of books about mothering and where I didn't find what I needed, and that was really time consuming. And in the end, I think that Lisa Bratcher book was the most helpful, and then just sort of the realization at some point, oh, there was this great obscure Italian philosopher, Adriana Cavarero, who talks about subjectivity as being essentially biographical, as being a story that somebody tells about you, that you can't see yourself in yourself, for yourself. Somebody else has to bring you that gift of subjectivity by acknowledging that you too have a story in which you are the main character, and then thinking about the mother as the main character or the hero of the protagonist of her own life made me realize, oh, I've been talking about these things that happen to mothers, but I haven't really put my writers at the center of their own motherhood and thinking about what that meant in the moments when they were pushed out of the center and the moments when they regained the center of their own lives became really important for me. And somebody else said, what do you want people to take away from reading this book? And I think that's what I want them to take away from it, is that motherhood is a story of becoming. It's, you know, it's not just a thing that happens to you. It's not that, you know, you get moved out of your sort of central place in the Oedipal triangle, because it's really hard to So you have to kind of think against Freud and think against psychology to put the mother at the center of the Oedipal triangle and think about what is happening to her. How is she growing? How is she changing? How does she exist in time? And the possibility that a mother has a story, a life story as a mother, is what I'd like people to get out of.
I love that. I think that's the perfect way to end this discussion. And thank you so much, Julie. And where can people find you and your work?
I have a website, julie-phillips.com, and the book is out now in hardcover. It'll be out in paperback next spring. Yeah.
It's so, so good. Really cannot recommend it more highly. It's I, as a writer mother, I like underlined pretty much every single page. There are dog ears all over the place that I will be returning to. And and I feel so grateful to be able to have had this conversation with Julie. It's just really a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me, Karen, to do this.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for this great conversation, and Liz for moderating, and everybody for attending. And we will make the recording of this available if you want to share it with some of your students that you're friends with that were not able to attend. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so I hope it's helpful for people, for writers in thinking about life writing, as well as in thinking about how to make the circumstances of your own life conducive to work, but also about how to think about how to tell the story of somebody's work.
Yeah. And I should also mention that if and Julie and I have talked about potentially having her do something with us at Scribente Maternum, but we do have this community for writer moms at scribentematernum.com. So we will have a retreat next year. And so it's a really amazing, Carla, one of our co-founders, Carla, is here. She says, absolutely, yes. So, this is kind of a lot of what we talk about throughout our events, our virtual events, and then also our in-person retreats on like navigating that creativity as a mother and then tapping into it, really.
There's a question if you can post the URL for that.
Oh, yeah. Does everyone see the chat? Oh, no, wait, I just did post panelists. I don't know if I can, well, maybe Karen can maybe send it out.
Yeah, we can send out the link to that when we send out the link to the recording. So
okay, Peter just sent it out and
he did. Okay.
to everyone.
There
Thank
it is. All right, great. Well, again, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Julie and Liz. And we will be in touch with the next author reading next month. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for having me here.